Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Anna Gzuma Abousse. I'm the director of the Weiser Centers. I don't usually speak like this, but my voice is shot. We're very happy today to welcome Karima Benoun, and delighted that our own Muga Gocek, professor of sociology and women's studies, will be serving as a respondent. Karima Benoun is a law professor at the UC Davis School of Law and a proud graduate of the University of Michigan Law School and of the Rackham Graduate School. She's one of the foremost experts on international law and human rights, and she's received numerous awards for both her teaching and her scholarship. Her publications have appeared not only in major leading academic journals, but also have been widely cited by everyone from Slate to the United Nations. And a testament to just how widely she is regarded, as an expert in the field. She has spoken on media programs that range from NPR to its diametric opposite, Fox News. She has also advised Amnesty International, the Soros Foundation, UNESCO, and many others. In short, she's a public intellectual whose work speaks clearly to scholarly, moral, and political concerns. And we're delighted to welcome Karima here today, as she will speak on an aspect of her book, Your Fatwa Does Not Apply Here, Untold Stories from the Fight Against Muslim Fundamentalism. Welcome.
Let me thank the organizers for inviting me, thank the Weiser Center. It's really wonderful to be here. Back at the University of Michigan, I have long family history here. I actually, in part, grew up on North Campus because my father got his PhD here in the anthropology department, and then came back myself to study law, and then came back as a visiting professor. So Ann Arbor seems to be the great magnet, and it pulls me back. And it's a thrill to be here with people who were my professors and fellow students and friends. And it's also a great pleasure to be able to speak about the topic I was asked to address today, which is specifically women in the post-Arab Spring environment, as we would call it here in the U.S. And so what I'm doing is essentially drawing on a particular aspect of my book, one of the particular chapters. And the title of this lecture asks a question: is it time to stop calling it the Arab Spring? There's a lot of debate about this term. And the title also proposes to answer this question by reconsidering North Africa through the eyes of women's rights defenders in the region who have disappeared out of a lot of the press coverage of late. We heard a lot about them back in 2011, but we have heard much less about them of late. And so what I would like to do is to recenter their perspectives and their work as I learned about them in the research for my book. And this is a book that I interviewed about 300 people from nearly 30 countries, from Afghanistan to Mali and across North Africa, from Egypt to Tunisia to Algeria. And I did this specifically to learn about grassroots opposition to fundamentalism. And to try to really understand the local perspectives on this issue, because I really felt that in my field, which is international law, we don't do enough field work. We don't spend enough time actually listening to people on the ground telling us about what they see as the major human rights challenges in their regions. And I really wanted to try to do that. Now, based on what I heard, and certainly North Africa was not the only region that I visited, but based on what I heard from women in particular across North Africa while I was doing the research for the book, it seemed to me that the single most important human rights struggle in the region right now is the one currently being waged against Muslim fundamentalism in the wake of what we like to call the Arab Spring. Now, let me rush to say there are many other human rights struggles in the region which are critical, whether it is the struggle for economic justice, which was one of the key motivators for the uprisings of 2011 in the first place, whether it is the struggle against counter-revolution by sort of overthrown autocrats, or indeed the ongoing problem of other forms of autocracy. All of those remain incredibly important. But I would say, especially for women and for the region as a whole, it is the struggle against religious extremism that is the most critical at the moment. And I'm going to try to make the case for that using some of the interviews that I did with women on the ground. Now, in my view, international engagement with North Africa at the moment, and I'm going to focus on North Africa rather than looking at the entire region of what we call the Arab Spring. When the international community engages with North Africa, especially in the fields of democratization and law reform and human rights, I think international institutions and international global civil society need to recognize how central this challenge is to human rights from fundamentalism at the moment. and tried to find ways to support its opponents rather than sort of crumbling into the all too common cultural relativism that we so often encounter when there is international engagement with the region, which kind of becomes the exception, the place where we're not going to talk about human rights. And I think if the initial phases of the revolts in 2011 were about anything, they were really about saying people in this region to have human rights, economic, social, and cultural rights, civil and political rights, just like anyone else in any other region, and regardless of the fact that those rights have now been violated for generations. It was about claiming those rights, maybe not always using rights language specifically. But I think if we want to be true to that spirit of 2011, it's very important to remember those early claims. Now, what I'm saying about the challenge posed by fundamentalism in the region now, and to women in particular, is but a manifestation of a broader global challenge from religious extremism. And it's interesting to note, in my field, one of the leading feminist books written by two international lawyers called Hillary Charlesworth and Christine Chinkin. It's called The Boundaries of International Law, a Feminist Analysis. It's kind of the touchstone work of feminist international law from 2000. In that book, looking at the entire world, these scholars identified what they called religious extremism as one of the two biggest threats to women's human rights worldwide. So what I am looking at is a particular regional manifestation of a broader global problem that transcends religious boundaries. And to me, it's very important to try to understand that, even if this region may be facing particularly severe challenges in this regard at the moment. And just to kind of emphasize the severity of the problem in the context of the transitions post-2011, let me start by sharing the words of a former student of mine from Tunisia who did a lot of work to help me with some of the follow-up research for the book. And I wrote to her, she's a very brilliant young lawyer, and I wanted to ask her what she would say if she had the chance to speak to Americans in the current moment about the issue of local resistance to fundamentalism. Her country is now ruled by Ennahda, the Islamist party, Ennahda, and there is an ongoing, at the moment, popular struggle, again, like 2011, demonstrations in the street, demonstrations in front of the Constituent Assembly, and so on, to try to get the Ennahda government to dégage. And here is what she said she would want to explain if she had the chance to speak to Americans about the current moment. She said, "If I have something to say, it would be to ask Americans to wake up. Americans have to stop considering that the nightmare that we are living under the rule of these fundamentalists is part of our culture and identity, and that being oppressed by fundamentalists is all that we are entitled to, and that this nightmare is a moderate one just because we don't yet have stoning and amputations as punishments. Those," she said, "who are making us endure this nightmare are called moderate when we are the ones who are suffering and dying. Suddenly, they become terrorists when the ones who are suffering and dying are not Arab or from Muslim heritage. But we are tired of paying the bill for the West's misperception and misrepresentation of the reality. When the West realizes that these fundamentalists are not so moderate as it thought, or that perhaps it is no longer in its interests to claim that they are moderate, they will come to get them, using the war on terror. And then again, we will pay the bill. In both cases, we will pay it with our blood." And I was really struck by this email because I think it gives a sense of the depth of the emotion and the sense that many people in the region who oppose religious extremism have, that their work and their struggle and the challenges they face are not understood well by the international community and are not understood in the West, and the sense that they are not receiving the international support that they need. And for me, that's really the starting point of this discussion. Now, a couple of side notes before I get into some of the passages from the book about North Africa. One that's sort of, I guess, my joke for the afternoon, and that is that in February of 2011, just after the fall of Mubarak and the fall of Ben Ali before him, my editor began to worry that my book, because it was a book about Muslim people of Muslim heritage challenging extremism, including in North Africa, had become obsolete. That this was a topic that didn't matter anymore, and that the liberal Arab Spring had had rendered this subject entirely moot because Islamism was now irrelevant. Remember those heady days of February of 2011 and all the articles about how Islamism has nothing to do with these revolts and so on, and how the fundamentalists are not in the forefront of leading these movements, and the claims on the ground that are being made are not religious or theocratic claims. Now, my editor was terribly worried about this, and I, of course, was delighted. I mean, for a moment, just to think as an advocate who's been working on these issues for 20 years, what a wonderful possibility that would be, that these democratic struggles could really go forward indeed as democratic struggles. And, of course, it turned out that she had nothing to worry about, and I was very quickly disappointed, which is the punchline, and for better, perhaps for the book, but for much worse for people in the region, the issues covered in the book remain sadly relevant. Now, let me say something about what Muslim fundamentalism is. What do I mean when I use that term? It's a very contentious term. As an academic, I could give the whole talk just about that, and I won't do that. I made a conscious choice to use this term, though, and I think I should give the definition that I give in the book, which comes from an Algerian sociologist named Mariameh Eli Lucas. And she was one of the founders of an organization called the Network of Women Living Under Muslim Laws, which works on these issues transnationally. And the definition that she gives of fundamentalisms, note again the S, so she's not just talking about movements within Islam here. So for her, fundamentalisms are political movements of the extreme right, which in a context of globalization manipulate religion in order to achieve their political aims. So what we're essentially talking about for her, and indeed for me, are political projects, not basically spiritual movements. Saadia Abbas, a Pakistani post-colonial theorist, has referred to this as the radical politicization of theology, which is, I think, another very helpful way to think about these movements. And it's very important to me to make that distinction between Islam, which is one of the world's great religious traditions, practiced in a diversity of ways by more than 1 billion people, or a heritage that is very important to at least that many people as well, and Islamism, right, which is a set of political movements. I term them fundamentalist, but you often hear the term Islamist in the literature. We can talk about some of the differences. Now, it's interesting to think, for me as a human rights lawyer, about what the impacts are on human rights of these movements. And again, I'm going to risk generalizing here by speaking regionally, but the fundamentalists speak regionally and transnationally about the Ummah, and I thought it was very interesting to try to think about the problem also from the transnational perspective from the other side, although there are always risks there that you're going to be generalizing. But nevertheless, I think it's clear that when we look at these movements across the regions, they tend to advocate discrimination against women in particular, discrimination against religious minorities, discrimination against other sects within Islam, and sometimes discrimination against anyone who doesn't choose to practice Islam in the way that they do. They also advocate violence against women and often justify violence against women. They seek to advance practices like corporal punishment that violate human rights law and often talk about bringing those into the penal law of the country. They seek to stifle freedom of expression through blasphemy laws, threats against writers and artists, and so on. They tend to demonize human rights defenders, especially women's human rights defenders. And I think their single most important human rights impact, though it's not often thought of in this way, is that they often seek to stifle the freedom of religion of virtually everyone else in the context where they are operating. Now, sometimes they use the claim of freedom of religion to advance the project, so I think it's also very important to use it as a way of critiquing what they are in fact doing. Now, just one last sort of note before I get to the stories. Again, looking at this as an international lawyer, I find it very interesting that as far back as 1999, in a very notable report to what was then the UN Commission on Human Rights, the UN Special Rapporteur on Religious Intolerance, who at the time was a gentleman named Abdel Fattah Amr, who is a Tunisian law professor, wrote his report focusing on what he called, again, religious extremism. And he framed it at that time, back in 1999, as a rising threat to human rights. And he was very concerned, and again, he was looking ecumenically across religious traditions, Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Islam, and many others. And he called for, at that time, back in 1999, the elaboration of a set of particular international standards to deal with how to respond to the problem of religious extremism, how to protect human rights in the face of it. And that is a recommendation that was absolutely never heeded at the international level. We don't have those standards. Nobody really engaged, took up his recommendation. And I think so many things that have happened since he wrote that report in 1999 have really shown how important a recommendation it was. So with all that background, then, let me share a few excerpts from the chapter in my book, which is the relevant chapter for this topic. And the chapter is called Sidi Bouzid Blues and the Green Wave, Journeys Through the Arab Spring and Fall. You see, I can't get away from these seasonal metaphors either, and we can talk about them and how useful they are and so on. But let me just say a little bit about the title of the chapter and a little bit about its content. So it is based on interviews that I conducted with women's rights defenders and others in North Africa in the spring and in the fall of 2011. And there was a notable difference between the tone in the spring and in the fall. It was one of the most difficult to write because the topic is absolutely a moving target, and so I was rewriting it as the book went to press, and it's already out of date, as you will see, obviously, because it does not include the summer's events in Egypt and in Tunisia. But I will try to bring in some of those events because I spent last summer in North Africa as well, and I'm now sort of compelled by this topic, so I just keep interviewing even though the book is done. So I will talk a bit about that. Now, for those of you who don't work on North Africa, Sidi Bouzid, of course, is the hardscrabble town of some 40,000 people in central Tunisia, about 160 miles south of Tunis, where Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire in December of 2010 and sparked a revolt which led to the fall of Ben Ali in January 2011 and then spread around the world. Now, the term the Green Wave, so it's Sidi Bouzid Blues and the Green Wave, is a term that some commentators in North Africa use to describe the subsequent rise of fundamentalist movements in the region. Green being associated in this region with Islamist parties, and I know that can be somewhat confusing for people who work on Iran, where the Green movement means something altogether different. Now, I did use the term Arab Spring in the title, and it is, I'm the first to concede, a problematic term, although I also find that when you're writing a trade book, unfortunately, sometimes the only way to make yourself understood is to use the buzzword. So I found myself using it. But of course, there are problems both with the Arab part and the spring part of Arab Spring. So in North Africa, many of the people who were involved were not Arabs. Of course, many were, but there were also Amazight people in Libya, in Algeria, in Tunisia, in Morocco, in Egypt, Nuba people, and so on. And they, too, were fighting for inclusive democracy. So it was not just all about sort of Arabness, and I think one has to be quite sensitive about that. And, of course, there's the difficulty with the spring part. So some would say because of its overly positive connotations, although we'll talk a bit about that. And some would say because of its seasonal connotation, right? The idea that this is something that could happen very quickly and then you sort of move on. And in fact, in the region, nobody uses the term Arab Spring except when they're translating from things written in English, but they tend to refer to the revolutions. So I'll come back to that. But that's just the long introduction to the title of the chapter. And so a few passages then from Sidi Bouzid Blues and the Green Wave. So I stood in the spot where Mohamed Bouazizi had set himself on fire and unknowingly sparked what became known as the Arab Spring. And I find here that all the pressures and disappointments faced by young people of modest means across the region that sometimes turn their thoughts to paradise infused the air with a longing to truly live, to matter. I burn, therefore I am. That was how an article in the Algerian press explained why an increasing number of North Africans were self-immolating around the time of Bouazizi's death. This was not at all a one-off event, unfortunately. Those whose misery is normalized know they are only visible when they burn, though just for one awful moment. I wanted them to see me die, one woman was quoted as saying after trying to set herself on fire. On the March day in 2011, when I visit the southern town of Sidi Bouzid, unemployed university graduates, much like the late Bouazizi, are again on hunger strike in a makeshift tent near the spot where he ended it all and started it all. And I am barraged with explanations for their fast. No one talks about Allah or about being Muslim. They are Tunisian, they want bread, honor, and dignity. Other than the ability to stay here in the tent in the public square and express their grievances, which was admittedly a significant advance over Ben Ali's Tunisia, these young denizens of Sidi Bouzid have seen no material benefit from the revolution yet. And a 22-year-old named Hossein warns me, I am ready to die. Will governments, I ask myself, in North Africa save the next generation of would-be Bouazizis? While forcing Ben Ali to dégage, as Tunisians say, or get out, is all to the good, the future of Tunisia remains unclear. Having escaped a relatively secular autocracy, are they now doomed to theocracy, or can they break out of the so-called Islamist dilemma, which offers these as the only available alternatives? That is perhaps the central question now across North Africa, and that was the question I came seeking answers to in spring 2011, a season like no other. Multitasking with the democratic women. When the Tunisian Democratic Women's Association, or ATFD, held an unprecedented Congress for Equality and Citizenship in March of 2011, 1,000 women gathered to discuss protecting and advancing their human rights in revolutionary Tunisia. That was the aspiration at the time. One woman in the audience, an activist in the revolution, wept as she took the floor over having already at that time been threatened by fundamentalist youth in the Kasbah after the fall of Ben Ali. They told her they would create an Islamic state, and she said that was not what she had revolted for, shouting back, maybe in Saudi Arabia, but not here. An Algerian woman went to the microphone and urged Tunisians to learn from what happened in her country in the late 80s. Islamism was what grew most rapidly in the petri dish of sudden democratization after the events of October 1988. They must, the Algerian woman urged the Tunisians, organize themselves very quickly against such an outcome. And at the time, it's interesting to remember, people were skeptical. They said, we're not like Algerians. And the interesting thing is now, when I was back in Tunisia this summer, everybody wanted to talk to me about Algeria. And they said, oh my God, maybe we're like Algerians and maybe we're going to face some of the same challenges. Now, everyone agreed at that meeting in 2011 that there could be no going backward. The crowd at the ATFD Congress knew that their country was one of the most advanced on women's rights in the region, indeed, among all Muslim-majority societies. In addition to the relatively progressive family law inherited from the Bourguiba era, access to abortion was won in 1965. 31% of lawyers and 27% of judges are female. In this moment, and I think this is so critical to understand, Tunisian women stood both to gain and to lose. There's been this kind of tabula rasa theory to the societies in transition now, as if nothing had been achieved before the revolts of 2011, and I think it's absolutely critical to understand that is not true, and in countries like Tunisia, there was also a great deal to lose, along with a great deal to gain. I think the Tunisian activists that day understood that if this country, one of the most secular, socially liberal Arab Muslim majority countries, were to fall to the fundamentalists, it would be a huge symbolic victory for the extremists. States of grace. On my last spring day in Tunis in March 2011, I interviewed Alia Shamari, who was a human rights lawyer under Ben Ali. Her husband, Khameis, who was sentenced to 5 years in prison during Ben Ali's time and has now become the Tunisian ambassador to UNESCO, was giving his own interview nearby. And I remember thinking that the air around Alia shimmered with possibility in that spring. We didn't think, she said, that we would live this extraordinary moment. And in Tunis, it did indeed seem in the spring of 2011 that anything was possible. We could be the first state of the global south, Alia envisaged, with a Muslim-majority population, to install a real democracy based on equality between men and women, based on judicial, economic, and social justice. And I remember thinking, Carthaginian utopia, but in that moment, it really seemed attainable. Now, Alia Shamari was euphoric, but she was not naive. And in fact, in that early phase, she was not in denial like many others in and out of North Africa about what dangers lie ahead. She recognized, as she said, the possibility of the confiscation of this revolution by the most retrograde currents of political Islam. Wahhabism exists in Tunisia, Salafists also. For them, she said, you must understand the objective is to destroy the republic and to install a caliphate. Nor does Shamari spare Ennahda, which has since become the ruling party. She said democracy is in danger with these people, the rights of women also. And she denounced in particular what she called the strategic discourse they use, quote, to make us believe they have become moderate. She pointed to the events of International Women's Day already back in 2011 to prove these claims untrue. She said just after March 8th, when we were calling for equality and inheritance, when we were calling for the freedom of Tunisian women to marry non-Muslim men, they showed their real face. They were against all of these demands. And so I asked Alia Shimari what strategies Tunisian feminists should employ in the face of these perils. Most of all, she wanted separation of religion and law. And I asked her whether the fundamentalists could ever accept a secular constitution. No, she said, they will scream atheism. They will say we are heretics. But what's interesting is that this did not dissuade her, and she was willing to make the argument and to make the argument publicly. She felt that a secular constitution was the best way to guarantee human rights in her country and was willing to demand it, whatever epithets might be thrown at her and however long it might take. And I think, some people might say, oh, that's not realistic. Well, it's the same refusal to kowtow to, quote, realism that made her and her husband oppose Ben Ali all those years when they could have had a comfortable middle-class life instead. Back in March of 2011, Alia Shimari suggested that there had to be a clear strategy to communicate that a separation of religion and state is the only way to guarantee everyone's freedom of religion. She stressed that she did not want political parties banned or people silenced. What she wanted was to see the fundamentalists countered by a progressive strategy of engaging youth and working on the ground in communities. She said some very interesting things that are not said often enough, I think, in the West in talking about these problems. She rushed to acknowledge that, quote, Islam is our heritage, but she rejected what she called, quote, all that is oppressive in Islam. And this is something very brave that she said, and in Islamic law, which is not of divine heritage. Now, Alia reminded me that it is everyone's right to question aspects of her own heritage, to try to take into the future that which is liberating and to leave in the past that which is not. And indeed, this is the only way humanity has ever advanced. But somehow it seems often in our discussions of these issues when it comes to Muslim-majority countries, people of Muslim heritage are not allowed, whether it's by fundamentalists internally or sometimes by people seeking authenticity outside in the West, to go through this same process of assessing their heritages and figuring out what they ought to mean, how they ought to evolve in the modern context. I have no confidence, Alia says, in any political current founded on an interpretation of religion that is not egalitarian and that talks about Islamic law as the essential referent. Religion, she opines, should not be used by any political party. It belongs to everyone. And then she said something which I think is one of my favorite statements in the book. I keep wanting to sort of make T-shirts that say this. She says, no one has the right to present themselves as the spokesperson of God. You can say, I am conservative. I think women are below men. But just don't say it is because you are a Muslim, because my interpretation of Islam is different. She thinks that the religion calls for equality. Now, she was already acutely aware of the closing window of the revolutionary moment back in the spring of 2011, and she was very concerned that the left and the liberals and the secularists needed to get organized and to unify, and she was already worried about the failure to do that. She said, we are living in a state of grace, and this will end soon. And she was already clear in March 2011 about the challenge that would lie before her compatriots as fall approaches. As I left, she called after me, we need to try to save democracy. The next section is called the Two Doas. In the spring of 2011, 6 weeks after the fall of Hosni Mubarak, the mood in Cairo is somber, less exultant than in Tunis. The scale of Egypt is so epic it makes everything more difficult. There are 83 million Egyptians waiting for the fruits of the revolution compared with 10 million Tunisians. In Cairo, I am under the protection of the two Doas, as I call them. Doa Abdelal and I work together through the network of women living under Muslim laws, and she sends Doa Qasim, 26-year-old, but towers over me by about 4 inches, to look after me. Now, Doa Qasim at the time was working for an NGO called the Andalus Institute for Tolerance and Anti-Violence Studies, and her brief included women's rights and youth political participation. She was trying at that time to increase the numbers of women in Egypt's parliament, and she had her work cut out for her. And of course, I thought of her instantly when the number of women in Egypt's parliament plummeted after the following elections. Back at that time, she was already lamenting. She said, you not only have men who are against women's participation, but you have women who are against women's participation. Doa K's fight for women's rights was going on at work, in the streets, and at home. From a conservative family, the personal truly was political for her, and the political very personal. Her 4 brothers, she told me, always tried to control her because I'm the honor of the family, as she put it. And this experience brought her to human rights, she said, which she discovered in college. Everybody born equal, as she described it. There should be no gender discrimination. I want this. During the 2011 revolution, Doa K weathered Molotov cocktails and water cannons and distributed Coca-Cola as a remedy against tear gas. As it was for many women, the revolution was a transformative moment for her. But she said she was already thinking about the morning after. She didn't really want to talk about the revolution anymore. She said it's easy to make a revolution, but it is much harder to build the country after that. She was also thinking about revolutions that had not happened yet, and I was really struck by such wisdom from such a young person. She said, the revolution changed the regime, but not the mentality of people. Stop changing the system. Change people's minds. If you still have the mentality that religion is everything in the world and we have to obey anyone talking by religion, this is a disaster. She was already fearing then, in the spring of 2011, that people would vote a certain way, not because of what they believed, but because they have, in her words, orders from imams and sheikhs. The Muslim Brotherhood, she warned me, is way, I loved the way she said this, way more organized than other political parties. They have money. Plus, they talk with religion. They say Islam is the solution. So poor people and illiterate people support them because of religion and money. And Doa K did not accept the thesis, just like Alia Shamari did not in Tunis, that the Muslim Brotherhood was moderate now. She is herself a devout liberal Muslim, as she describes herself, and was deeply upset when a Brotherhood leader had told her that if Egyptian Muslims accepted a Christian president of Egypt, they are not really Muslims. I asked her how people can challenge the Brotherhood, and again, this is back in 2011, and she said something I think very important. She said, go to the streets, go to the grassroots, talk to the poor people and in the rural areas. Stop conducting seminars in hotels. Everywhere I go to seminars in hotels. Some of them may be very important, but I'm always remembering this comment that she made. You cannot counter movements like the Brotherhood through seminars in hotels. She said, let ordinary people see that you are interested in tackling their problems. And I think those are some of the major challenges for the secularist and liberal movements in the region. Now, with all the battles she had fought and won, Doa K was still afraid that women's rights would face a backlash in Egypt. Like what happened in Afghanistan, she said, or Sudan. People voluntarily stop you and ask you why you are not veiled and stuff like that because there are more Salafis in the streets now. Now, Doa K does cover her head and wears long skirts, but she is the most festive veiled woman I have ever seen, wearing elaborate color-coordinated outfits in pink and turquoise. And she was always telling me to wear more color. And she said with her head covered the way that she covered it, you could see it in people's eyes that spring of 2011 as things were beginning to change. They don't like the way you dress and your headscarf. It's not enough if you're not dressed in a niqab or a full veil that is longer. She said they're going to say bad things about you. You are not a Muslim for them. She said that in particular since the revolution, it was not just a question of covering your head, but how and with what and what else was still showing. And I thought of the travails of this young woman. She was dealing with, even at that time, a lot of sexual harassment on the street and the difficulties at home and the difficulties of doing her work and her hopes and her fears for the future. And one of the single most heartbreaking moments for me in all the research for the book was when this bright young woman looked at me as we were riding in a taxi and said, I know that my life is going to be so difficult. Now, Doa Abdellel, who is the other Doa, is 35 years old, bareheaded and middle class. I was not born a feminist, she says. I became one. Originally from Upper Egypt, Doa A, as I call her, and her parents moved to Cairo in the 70s. She situates herself in the liberal camp, as she says. Though she is 10 years older than Doa K, the revolution was no less magical for her. Now, like the Tunisian women lawyers I met, Doa Abdellel wants what she calls a civil constitution, a gender-sensitive constitution. Above all else, she wants the constitution to guarantee equality. Then she wants to reform Egypt's family law. I mean, this is where the hopes were back in the spring of 2011. She said, look, if we want to change, we have to fight for it. We need a high ceiling of demands so that if we compromise, we don't lose. If we introduce a moderate agenda, definitely we will get nothing. And I really sensed her impatience at that time, which has turned to disappointment since then. She said, we cannot postpone women's issues. We cannot postpone the rights of half the population. Now let me jump far forward because I see that time is running out here. But I held a follow-up Skype then with Doa Abdelal as often as I could, and she sounded increasingly weary but resolute. She said everyone has realized there is no way back as things began to deteriorate in Egypt with the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood and the nature of its governance. She said, look, we can't go back, we have to go on. And she sighed as she considered the landscape. She was somebody who was very opposed to the military and military rule, but also an ardent opponent of the Brotherhood, and in particular the way that the Brotherhood ruled in Egypt. She said to me, Karima, sometimes you cannot imagine that these are the choices. We have to create more choices, and I think that is the central challenge, the construction of a viable alternative. Now, considering this same problem, the Algerian satirist Shawki Amari explained in an opinion piece what he called the convergence between head-shrinking autocratic Arab nationalism and fascist-type Islamism. Again, remember, he's a satirist. This is the way that satirists talk. But I thought it was very interesting, his analysis. The common points between the head-shrinking autocratic Arab nationalists and the fascist-type Islamists, in his view, were contempt for the individual and an aversion to collective and individual freedoms. And what was so interesting to me is that Doa Abdelal was absolutely rejecting this idea that she had to somehow choose the head-shrinking autocrats on the one hand or the fascist-type Islamists, and was absolutely determined to try to create something better. She was hoping at that time that the fundamentalists would be constrained by the realities of politics and the needs of Egyptians. She said, the whole infrastructure of the society is really shaking, and some of the small, faraway governorates and villages are really poor. They need to come up with a real political solution, not about covering women's heads. And then she said something that I thought was absolutely brilliant. She said, I don't think that reciting Quran over a broken pipe will fix it. Now, we all know what then subsequently happened in the summer of 2013 when in both Egypt and Tunisia, ordinary people had had enough of fundamentalist rule and took to the streets in massive protest against that rule with differing outcomes. We see, of course, that the Muslim Brotherhood was ousted in Egypt. Nahda remains in power in Tunisia for the moment, and the transitional dialogue has just broken down. And the challenge is ongoing in both of these countries to really find a safe haven for the transitions that began in 2011. Now, Doa Abdelal wrote to me from Egypt again on August 14th, which was the night of some of the worst violence between the security forces and the Muslim Brotherhood protesters. And I was really struck again by what she wrote. And it's so important to me to try to convey these voices because we're not hearing these voices directly. She said, we all worked hard for turning years of oppression, torture, and authoritarian rule into something better. When the revolution started in 2011 until now, none of us thought twice about giving time, money, blood, and life for the change. But the Islamists hijacked the scene and took us backwards. Some of us, like me, were ready to believe in them, but they failed everyone, and they failed even their believers. The worst thing is they were attacking Copts, Shia, and all who are different, and clashing with security forces who are not trained for such confrontations. They failed us when we asked for reforming the Ministry of the Interior, and when we asked for the army budget to be monitored by the civilian government. They failed us when they pushed for a rushed constitution, and a lot more. And this is, I think, a very critical point that is not well understood outside, they emphasize that democracy is only about elections, forgetting about the rule of law and freedoms once they take power. We, the pro-democracy groups, have no other option but to revise our strategies and go back to work again. But I have to say, we are tired, and this is something I heard again and again from activists. It's been a very long 3 years. Still, she says, if we want to change, we have to keep moving. However, if the world keeps lamenting that representative democracy died in Egypt, this will not help because what we look for is the democracy that respects all and listens to all voices. Now, I think considering these developments, considering these voices, considering the experience of women since 2011, what is very important to underscore is that the fate of women in these revolutionary transitions is not a minority concern. It's not a side issue. It goes to the heart of the entire project. As Alia Shamari had told me in Tunisia in March of 2011, you cannot create democracy without half the population. And Professor Fatou Sow, who was in the clip that you saw from Senegal, I think correctly pointed out in an article written around the time of the 2011 revolts that the process of achieving equality between the sexes is actually at the heart of political debates about the transformation of contemporary societies. We really need to bring the democratization debate and the women's rights debate together. They are one and the same. Now, this is true everywhere, but nowhere more than in the Middle East and North Africa region, where according to the recently released Global Gender Gap Report for 2013, the region ranks the lowest on the scale in terms of the political empowerment of women, with only 7% of the gender gap reportedly being closed. And in fact, 7 of the lowest countries on the political empowerment sub-index are from this region. Now, many Western Democrats and sort of democracy advocates in a rush to embrace the Arab Spring overlooked this. As the French-based North African women's group Ni Putes Ni Soumises noted back in 2011, faced with the increasing exclusion of women from the public sphere in the face of the growth of Islamist movements, Western democracies have not hesitated to salute without reservation the emergence of the new democracies on the other side of the Mediterranean. No one was really talking about the rights of women as a part of democratization and the requirements of democratization. This, again, was really seen as a kind of side issue. So this then brings us back to the question of what we ought to do about whether or not to call this the Arab Spring. What do we make of these transitions that began in 2011 and where they have gone now and where they may be going in the future? I think it's absolutely important, while recognizing the tremendous dangers at the moment, to also maintain some optimism. And I was really inspired by some of the women on the ground who are doing this. And I think of Bushra Belhaj Hamida, who is a prominent Tunisian activist and lawyer and has been receiving regular death threats, and yet tells me that she will not give up hope. She says, in the worst moments when we had Ben Ali, we kept hope and we made him dégage, get out. Now we will show that we are here, that we exist, and that they are not the majority and cannot impose their rules on us. They represent 30 or 35%. 35% cannot impose their rules on us all. And I think that's a critical thing really to understand. But should we then stop calling this the Arab Spring? You know, that's the question that I return to in closing. Now, it's interesting, I asked actually a Lebanese women's rights activist named Lina Abu Habib about what the biggest challenges in the region were in the post-Arab Spring environment, and she quipped, well, the biggest challenge is to stop calling it Arab Spring. People are, I think, there's a lot of unhappiness about this term. And the Tunisian woman lawyer, the young woman lawyer whose words I started with, felt even more strongly about this. She wrote from Tunisia saying, "Stop calling this a spring. The Arab Spring is depicted as a miracle, a blessing. In reality, it is becoming more and more of a curse, the curse of Islamism." Of the Islamist-dominated government in her country, the Tunisian journalist Olfa Riahi said in August, "I have never been as despairing as I am today. I feel as though there will never be elections and they will never give up power. Those we are facing off are fascists, and they have brainwashed thousands. They say that opposition to them is a plot against Islam." Now, I guess what I'm asking us to do is to balance both the despair and the ongoing optimism, and to come up with something somewhere in the middle, a kind of vigilant optimism which maintains some of the best spirit of 2011, some of the new openness in some areas in the region, but is very concerned about where the pushback has been, and especially concerned about that going forward. I do believe that the stakes are as high as those women indicated. But I also believe that there is still hope, as Bushra Belhaj Hamida told me, for the democratic struggle in these regions unleashed in 2011. But I think what is clear to me from this research is that the struggle against fundamentalism must also be at the core of the democratic struggle. Rule by religion is incompatible with the rule of law or democracy. It's perhaps a controversial thing to say, but I'm going to say it nonetheless, and it's something that I learned from this research. And really the only hope for women's human rights in the region is the resounding defeat of fundamentalism. But let me be very clear, as Bushra Belhaj Hamida was when I interviewed her, this is something that needs to be done in a peaceful way, in a way that respects human rights. What she was talking about, again, was popular organizing on the ground. And I was very struck by the speech given by Mbarka Brahmi, who is the widow of an assassinated Tunisian politician, Mohamed Brahmi. And she said in front of the Constituent Assembly in Tunis, the people will bring down the obscurantists and the terrorists, but we will sweep them away with civilized methods, not with their methods, with social movements in every corner of Tunisia. And we will win, justice will win, Tunisia will win, a civil republic will win over the dark Tunisia that they wish for. Now, of course, what is clear to me is that for Mbarka Brahmi's prophecy to come true, activists on the ground are going to need international support and, at the very least, international comprehension of the contexts in which they are living. And I think one of the ways to build that support and one of the ways to build that comprehension is really to listen to their voices, raised in protest, saying again and again, loudly as I heard them, to their country's fundamentalists, your fatwa does not apply here, which is the title of the book. So I will stop there and, sorry if that was long, turn over to the discussant.
Well, thank you very much for sharing with us your interpretation of what is going on there. I also come from the Middle East, but from a different part of it. I'm from Turkey, and Turkey, interestingly enough, had a different experience with respect to dealing with Islamists. And before, so what I obviously will be talking about is based on that experience. Nevertheless, what I was struck about when you talk about activists was they portraying the other side of the Islamists or the fundamentalists as the they, which sort of definitely points to a polarization where even though this is supposed to be a movement for the entire country, you still have in there we and they. That is one aspect of it. I mean, so that of course leads one to think that the story you are telling, of course, is a story, but it's the story of one side. It is not the story of two sides. What would the other side comprise? This is not in any way, taking issue or, approving of what the other side is. I think, though, what is very important is historicity. If you think about history of all of these regions, and that is also including Turkey, you are talking about an excluded group. The Islamists, or at least religiously conservative, because of the adoption of Western-style democracy, had been excluded for at least 30, 40, 60, 80, 100 years. If you exclude such people from democracy, you cannot expect them to understand what democracy entails. I mean, that is unfortunately, this is a sad thing to say, but they are, of course, going to repeat the mistakes that have been done before. And unfortunately, the autocracies, the autocratic regimes within which they at least were existing, excluded them, and now they are excluding the ones before them. I mean, this is not, I am not saying this is good or bad. It is sad, basically. I mean, why is it sad? It's interesting, you said that the first ones were autocratic nationalists, the other ones are fascist Islamists. what's the future going to be? The future is going to come out of these two groups. There is no third group. I mean, there are liberals, yes, but are liberals a third group? I do not know. I mean, and why do I say this? I mean, I say this on the one hand, carrying out social science analysis on the one side, and also coming from that society, from one such society on the other. In Turkey, 1923 to basically 2003, we had an autocratic regime of one sort that was militantly secular and excluded all the Islamists. After 2003, unlike other places, through the democratic regime, it took them pretty much, a decade to come, and they are recently in power. They are also, at the moment, attacking some women's rights. They are, at the moment, trying to change the constitution. Our prime minister, unfortunately, interprets the whole system in a way. He says, I have 50% of the vote. I don't care about the other 50%. How are you going to teach that person that that is not how it works? He has never been included before. He has no idea what it means to bring the other 50%. That is the problem. So, of course, I talked to people in Turkey. When they were being excluded, I actually voted for them, not because I agree with their ideology, but I take issue with their exclusion. They should not be excluded. They are and ought to be a part of the body politic. But now that they come to power, my friends, liberals like me, say to me, hey, you brought these people, see what happens? But, I will not go back on my decision. I still had to make sure that they are included in the system. But when we're talking about what happens in Egypt, that Morsi is ousted, these are a couple of years. In social change, things occur over decades. And I think the important thing, however, is to make sure that these groups do not see each other as polar opposites. They are all a part of the same nation and the same body politic. I think that is the mentality that has to change. So it would be important to tell the same story and the same book that you have written from the point of view of saying your rights do not apply here, because they are basically very much interested in justice. It is a whole different conception that they oppose to rights. And that is, I think, you are, of course, a human rights lawyer. You are living in the United States. This is a system predicated on human rights. But human rights, as we see it here, derive from our own practices. They do not come from any place else. Different contexts generate different practices and different priorities. I think that is what you need to take into account. I have many friends also who take issue with the way human rights had been politicized and employed to exclude people in the past. That cannot be the only discourse. I am not against human rights, mind you. That is not what I'm saying. I'm saying there ought to be a spectrum of rights and spaces. Human rights cannot be the only space within which you judge. You have to bring in culture, you have to bring in practices, and relativism is not what I'm saying either. So I'll leave at that, and thank you for listening to my comments. Bye.
Thank you for taking the time to come and listen and to reply. I think we have very different views about these, and that's a healthy debate, I think, to have. The first thing I would say is that everyone has been excluded from democracy. I think it's entirely wrong to suggest that only Islamists have been excluded from democracy in many of these countries. Everyone has been denied the possibility of living in a democratic system in many of these countries. And so I think to claim that only for those who are Islamists is to me mistaken. Furthermore, for me, what you called religiously conservative is not the same thing that I'm talking about. And in fact, a number of the people who I cited who are anti-fundamentalist are themselves religiously conservative, like Mbarka Brahmi, the widow of Mohammed Brahmi, who I cited from her speech in front of the Constituent Assembly. So I am talking about specific politicized movements that have a theocratic project to use religion as a way of taking power and ruling, which is very different than making personal choices about how you perhaps want to practice in your family. Polarization, I think that is something that many people in the region share your concern with, and certainly I would encourage you to read the book because I was only able to give very brief excerpts, and I did an interview with Emel Gremmi, a Tunisian professor recently, which is on the Open Democracy website, and she is very concerned about this issue of polarization and the need to try to speak across this divide within the society. But I also think, and many people, a Pakistani in particular, said to me, polarization is perhaps a good thing in the sense that you have to be very clear about what the political struggle is and where the political camps stand and what they stand for. And I think that that is not a bad thing. Four, I have to absolutely dispute the idea that there is no third group. And in fact, the third group is represented in the book. They don't have as much resources. They're not as well organized. They face huge challenges in terms of actually offering a viable governing alternative or an alternative that can win elections. But there absolutely is a third group out there. I remember interviewing Sharifa Bouata, an Algerian psychologist, who said, we reject the devil or the deep blue sea. We reject this idea from the West that we're stuck with either Islamism or autocracy. We are determined to try to build the alternative, and I think that that is the big challenge out there. As to the criticism of human rights, I think there's a huge literature about this, but what I will tell you is that many people on the ground in the region are themselves human rights defenders who claim as much of a right to have human rights as anyone anywhere else, and I think of the words of Sana Ben Ashur writing in Tunisia. She said, are there human rights that we Tunisians are not entitled to? And one hears that discourse from the fundamentalists on the ground, but one also hears it from cultural relativists in the West, including in academia, where it's a very fashionable discourse. And I have to say, what my view of it is less relevant to me, but I heard time and again from people in the book, though they might conceive of rights in a different way, that rights were absolutely relevant to them.